Nic Tideman.
My father's father came to the United States from Sweden when he was 2. I don't know any Swedish, but my name is Swedish. I'm a professor of economics at a university whose short name is Virginia Tech. The long name is Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. I started my academic career as an urban economist, but I was also trained in public finance. And then I moved into the areas of collective decision-making and global economic justice. So that's my background. When Jonas asked me to speak about community land trusts, my first thought was I'd never studied community land trusts. But then I decided that the things that I do have expertise in are closely enough related to community land trusts that it was reasonable for me to talk about the subject. So, what is a community land trust? Community land trust is a nonprofit organization that holds title to a large amount of land and oversees the use of the land in the public interest. Usually, the community land trust leases land to individuals, and the individuals decide how to use the land, but within guidelines set by the trust. The people who lease the land have a right to renew the leases indefinitely, but at market interest rates rather than at the initial, at market lease rate, rent rates, rather than at the initial rate. The community land trust usually retains control over some land to serve public purposes. And the community land trust can serve as a vehicle for other activities in the public interest. Why would you want to have a community land trust? One of the ideas behind a community land trust is that land is everyone's common heritage, and we ought to have institutions that reflect the idea that land is everyone's common heritage. So the nonprofit organization takes control of the land and operates it in everyone's interest. So one might imagine an ideal world in which all land was held in trust for the community. So, and its rent would be collected and used for public purposes. Anyone who used more than his share of land would be compensating those with less than their shares, permitting reduction or elimination of economically harmful taxes, and permitting also what economists call the internalization of spatial externalities. You can charge people more if they harm their neighbors. You can give them credit if they do something that helps their neighbors. If we are not ready to do that on a basis that's across the whole community, at least we can do it on a smaller scale in the form of a community land trust. Community land trusts have their problems. If you're going to start a community land trust, you need to get title to land, and the land already belongs to somebody else. How are you going to get title to the land to start a community land trust? Well, you can go around to existing owners and try to persuade them to donate to the community land trust. I believe that there was a famous city in India that was started by someone going around and suggesting to the landowners that they should donate to the land. You can have people donate funds and use the donated funds to purchase land. You could have a local government decide to sponsor a community land trust and provide local funds with it to purchase the land. Or if you were thinking really big, you could say, let's take the whole community and turn the community into a community land trust. But that would require a political evolution a lot beyond where we are now. And the other main problem of a community land trust is to ensure its right orientation over time. How can you make sure that those who control the community land trust will continue to act in a reasonable understanding of the community interest. One thing you want to do is to work hard on the charter, to specify your understanding of what the community land trust is when you set it up. Another thing you want to do is to have a program of continuing community education, so that the young people, as they grow up, will understand what their elders are working with. And then you might think about arranging so that if things were going badly, someone would have the right to sue in court and restore things to a proper basis. So, if you're going to set up a community land trust, there are some important questions that you want to ask yourself. You're going to collect all this rent. How should it be divided? What should it be used for? You might say that some should be paid to the higher level of government for the services that they provide. Although I would say that the higher levels of government would only deserve that payment if they decided you could be a free trade zone, a tax-free zone. You might possibly come to a deal with the national government that you will pay a certain amount of rent to them if they will agree not to collect any taxes from you in exchange. That would be a very far-sighted thing to happen. I don't know if you could imagine it happening, but you could think about it. If you had a national government that was providing you services and wasn't taxing you, then you certainly would owe them a share of the rent. You might also ask whether some of the rent is owed to the global community. If you want to think of the earth as everyone's common heritage, then you can ask whether you have more than you share. That's a very complex calculation to make. You would have to figure out what the total value is of all the opportunities provided by nature before you can figure out whether you had more than you share. But if you had a lot of resources and somehow a very low population, it would be possible that you would like to calculate what you owe to the global humanity. You might want to take some of the rent and spend it on providing funds to people who undertake activities that make the land more valuable. People who plant beautiful gardens or who provide services, perhaps at a loss, but that are valuable to the community. We would want to ask, should some of the rent be directed this direction? Now, some is going to be spent on the administration of the trust. And in many organizations, that amount grows and grows without adequate justification. So you want to ask, what is a reasonable amount of rent to be spent on administration of the trust, and how would you try to ensure that it didn't exceed that? And then, I think it's quite likely that after you spend all the reasonable amounts on things that are worth doing, there will be some left over. And I would suggest that that ought to be divided among the members of the community in proportion to how many years they have lived there. The surplus would be generated by the activities. If you just moved in, you couldn't claim a share, but if you've been there 20 years, well, a lot of the value was due to what you had contributed. So that would be my suggestion for the disposition of the residual. Then another important question that a community land trust faces is what protection, if any, would you provide to individuals for increases in market land rents? Suppose that somebody builds a farm on the edge of a community and then the community grows and they want to keep their farm, but now it's a good place for businesses. If you're going to charge them a market rent, they're not going to be able to keep their farm. You say, well, we don't want to drive them off their farm, they can keep their farm and we'll only charge them a low rent. And you say, that's the kind of thing you have to take into account when you decide to plant a farm. You might have to leave if the region grows. Perhaps you would want to help form an institution of rent insurance, where people who wanted to count on being in one place could buy an insurance policy that would make sure that their rent would not become affordable, not become unaffordable for a specified number of years. Now, the older one category who often get protection from tax increases and might be candidates for rent increases as well. But some old people are very well off. I would oppose the suggestion that I should ever deserve a cut on rent because I'm old. I'm never going to be so old that I can't manage to pay the rent that I do or make it some accommodation. Then another category of people for whom one might entertain rent protection is the poor. And yet it's also possible for poor people to occupy valuable land that they can't use well. I would be inclined to give poor people some kind of adjustment assistance, but not a special long-term deal on low rent just because they can't afford it. Now, the one category that I'm particularly sensitive to is the old poor. If you are old and you are poor, you have a hard time adjusting to change. I've encountered studies to say that when you insist that old people move, they often die. So I wouldn't be opposed. I would favor a program of providing special rent assistance to old, poor people who find that rent is rising and they can't afford it. I would again say that large families might possibly be eligible for adjustment assistance, but not a cut in rent. If the rent around them rises, they should probably find some other place to live rather than continue to occupy unusually valuable land. Same with small businesses. Those who buy rent insurance, they might possibly deserve adjustment assistance, but I wouldn't give them a cut on rent unless the business was providing a service that added to the value of the community, and that provided the basis for the rent subsidy. So then we come to advantages of community land trusts. Planning is often limited by the inability of planners to direct that things happen. If you have a community land trust, you're in a much better position to say, we need a hardware store. We will rent this piece of land to someone who agrees to open a hardware store. So you have a better capacity for effective planning if you have a community land trust. When the community grows, land rent rises. When you don't have a community land trust, the increase in the value of land goes to people who didn't do anything to deserve it. You can share the value of the rising land if you have a community land trust. The community land trust might possibly want to operate a bank or a lending institution of some kind. And it would have the capacity to lend for development if it wanted to. Land speculation is often a problem. Especially in larger cities, you see vacant lots, parking lots, 1- or 2-story buildings right beside skyscrapers. The economic explanation of land speculation is that land is most valuable to the people who have the highest estimate of how rapidly it will rise in value. And the people who value land most for its potential rise in value generally overestimate how rapidly it rises in value. This is an example of what economists call the winner's curse. If you go to an auction and everybody's guessing what the object is worth and bidding on it. The person who gets the object wins it, is cursed by having paid too much for it. So similarly, the person who sees the greatest potential in the land overestimates how rapidly it will rise in value. Thinks that it shouldn't be used now because it will be worth so much more once everybody else realizes how valuable it is. And it goes unused or underused for generations. If you take the profit out of land speculation, you won't have that problem, and the community land trust will take the profit out of land speculation. The community land trust also makes it easier for people to get access to land. If you want to get a house, you have to come up with not only the price of the house, but the price of the land. If you can obtain the use of the land for an annual payment, you only have to pay for the house and not the land. And so young people will have a much easier time getting access to housing than under the system of private ownership of land. And then we have the problem of land cycles, property bubbles, land rises and falls in value. When it falls in value, we often have a banking crisis. People are appalled at the fall in the value of the houses. If you have the community land trust be the title holder of the land, people are not subject to the difficulties of living in an economy with land cycles, property laws. Risks for community land trusts. Rent will be left with the lessees. The city of Canberra in Australia was set up on the principle that the government would own the land and lease it at market rents. But they didn't increase the rent when the market increased. The community of Fairhope, Alabama was founded on the principle that the land would be leased to people at market rents. But it didn't happen. The rents that tenants had to pay stayed down. It's very difficult. Well, there's a great risk that you will leave all the surplus rent in the hands of whoever is lucky enough to start out there, rather than collecting it and distributing it the way it's intended by those who set up the land trust. You have the possibility of rent being set too high and driving people out, confiscating their improvements. You have to protect against that. You have the possibility of rent being set stupidly. Some people having rent that's too high and others having rent that's too low. You need to have good professionalism in the setting of rents. You have the possibility that rent will be collected and the bureaucrats will spend it on things that the community doesn't value. You have to protect against that in some way. You have the possibility that the land trust itself will become a land speculator. Saying, let's not put the land out now, let's wait until we can do something better with it. And land would be continuously underused. All these are risks you want to take into account in deciding the governance of your land trust. I have one more for that. Rent, well, you will want restrictions on land, but it's possible you have the wrong restrictions. You restrict things that don't need to be restricted and leave unrestricted things that should be restricted. It's hard to get the restrictions right. You want to think about principles for that. Now, Jonas and I share an interest in the idea of a community currency. And it would be possible to have a community land trust serve as the basis for issuing a local currency. Well, why would you want to have a local currency? One reason is because sometimes the national government doesn't create enough money. You have unemployment, people willing to work and unable to find work. And if you bring more currency into the economy, there will be people who want to buy the services of those who are unemployed. So you can reduce unemployment by adding money to a system if you don't add too much. Now, the people who manage the monetary system on a national basis are supposed to know what they're doing, but sometimes conditions aren't the same in all localities, and the policy that makes sense for the country as a whole doesn't make sense for one community. So you have the possibility of community stimulation if you have a community land trust. And my other reason is you can appropriate seniorage. Senior is the profit from printing a piece of paper that doesn't cost anything to print, but it will give you something for it if you give it to them. Seniorage now goes primarily to the banks, to a slight extent to the government. The banks create the money. If they were entirely in perfect competition with one another, they would compete away this profit, but they're not in perfect competition with one another. So they get a lot of profit out of the chance to make money out of thin air. So if the community instead could make money out of thin air, everybody can be richer because they have this stuff in their pockets and they don't need as much other money in their pockets and they can spend it. So that's a somewhat selfish reason. I think that if I were completely confident in the ability of the national authorities to manage the economy properly and make sure that every region was appropriately stimulated, I would be opposed to community land trusts. I might be opposed on the grounds that it wasn't fair for one region to take advantage of all the others. Or perhaps I would favor a system where all the money was community money and there wasn't any national money. But if you set up a local currency, to some extent you're getting away with something, I think, and you should be aware of that. If you're going to have a local currency, you have to have a set of rules for it to make sure it doesn't go badly. So my suggestion for a local currency for a community land trust would be that all the lessees, all the people who held leases on that, would receive a certain number of certificates when they were printed in proportion to the rent of the land they were renting. So you could say that, oh no, not in proportion to the land. That was my first idea, but I said no. Let's pass it out to people in proportion to the value of the improvements they have. Then the value of the improvements serves as a kind of collateral. You're making an interest-free loan to them, but the interest-free loan is based on the fact that they have added something to the community. They're putting these permanent improvements on the land. So you're in a sense, helping to finance the improvements and adding to the money supply of the community in the process. If you have the community suffering from unemployment, then you want to add to everybody's monetary stock, so that they will want to spend more money and put the people to work who are unemployed. If you find that, the money would be issued as rent certificates, so that if nobody else would take the money, you could always use the money to pay your rent. But if you issued so much that when you went to spend the rent certificates, people discounted it compared to other money, that would be an indication that you had issued too much, and you would need to ask people to pay back some of the loans, some of the interest-free loans that you made to them. A small enough basis that it wouldn't embarrass them financially. But a good rule is that you want to keep the money scarce enough that it's not discounted. When people let their improvements fall in value, then you could say, well, we don't want you to have so much money, we want to put the money in somebody else's hands instead. So it would be reasonable to say that as improvements fall in value, the interest-free loans need to be repaid. And if you want to terminate your lease, you owe all the money back before you get out of the lease, and then the person who has a new lease on the land, if he keeps the improvements, can apply for the loan on that basis. So that's my idea for the community land trust is a sponsor of the local currency. Then one might also think of local currency as the basis of a fail-safe deposit institution. What I mean by that is that you would keep an account at something that was sort of like a bank, but not exactly a bank, because it wouldn't make any loans. But instead of having all your rent certificates in the form of a piece of paper in your pocket, you would have them in an account with the office of the community land trust. And then you could write checks on the money. You could go to the grocery store and pay with a check, saying, please transfer 287 of my land rent certificates to the grocery store. And if this institution never made any loans, it would never have any possibility of failing. It would just be an institution that moved money around in response to the needs of the community to have an efficient system for moving it around. Accept deposits of local currency, but it makes no loans. Transfers funds as directed, converting check writing. It might possibly arrange for conversion of local currency into national currency, but you might want to leave that activity to somebody else. That requires additional source of national currency, and it could be a somewhat dangerous thing to do, but you could think about doing that.
A question?
Yes.
Could you use the local currency or the rent certificates as collateral for a bank loan, like if you want to build on your community land trust?
Not for this institution. Well, but banks can have whatever procedures they want. I think that it would make more sense to use it as a down payment rather than as collateral. So, I think of this fail-safe deposit institution as not a bank because it doesn't make loans. And I think it might be important to establish that with the national authorities, because there are rules for what you have to have in order to be a bank, and you would say, no, we don't have a bank, we have this other thing. Can't fail from bad loan because it doesn't make loans. And it would have some expenses, it would have to earn some income, and so you would have fees for fund transfers, and possibly for the storage of money. Separately, you could think of a land trust as the sponsor of an investment fund. If people in the community want to participate in help financing their neighbors as one way of earning a return on their money, then they can put it into an organization that makes loans. And I think it's important to have such an institution, again, be different from a bank, that it wouldn't accept money as deposits, because it wouldn't promise to give you all your money back. If you wanted your money back, you'd have to sell your shares in the investment fund for whatever you could get from them. And maybe you'd get full value or more, maybe you couldn't. There would be a quarterly dividend paid based on your profit. You could redeem your investment, but if you wanted to redeem your investment, you'd say, I want my investment back at the end of the month, and at the end of the month, the institution would find out if there are other people who wanted to deposit, and if not, they would have to find out at what price they could sell some shares to give you back, and you could get what you could get for the shares. You would be perfectly free to sell your shares to somebody else at whatever price was agreed, as with other property you might own. And those are my thoughts about the community land trust. Should we take questions now?
Yeah, we can take questions now because we need to have a regular coffee break later.